Going over GDP, or how we measure if our economy is doing great or if our economy is doing badly. First, we need to understand the three main economic goals of any country or society. First, we have to promote economic growth. Second, we limit unemployment to a point. We don't want 0% unemployment, but we want some unemployment. And then we want to limit and control inflation. Today, we're just going to be covering the first one. How do we promote economic growth and how do we measure that? Well, we do that by using GDP. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product, and GDP is the dollar value of all final goods and services produced in a country within a year. This means it's basically what a country produces as a final product, or it could be a service, in one given year. So, we can measure a country and how big their economy is based on GDP. For instance, I believe the United States, currently their GDP is 28 trillion. So, they're the biggest economy. They produce the most stuff. But then compare that to another country, let's say Pakistan. Pakistan has a GDP of $300 billion. Then we know that Pakistan is dramatically smaller than the United States. They produce less services and goods. So it tells us how well and how big the economy of a country is doing. Now we need to understand GDP growth and GDP per capita. GDP per capita is the way we measure the quality of life and well-being of a country. Researchers, economists have figured out that the more GDP per capita a country has, the higher quality of life they have. But what is GDP per capita? Well, it's a simple equation. GDP divided by population. Simply, it's how much one individual on average is producing for a society. For instance, a good country like the United States produces 28 trillion. Divide that by our population, which I believe is 330 million, and the GDP per capita is around 70,000, which relatively across the entire world, 70,000 per capita is really good. But then compare that to another country, let's say the DRC or the DR Congo. Their GDP per capita, I believe, is like 1,000. So their GDP per capita is dramatically smaller, and that shows that they're producing less per person and thus are less developed. Just imagine if we made a country with only one individual. If that one individual in the GDP was $100, then that country not only would be really small, but that one person would be really poor. But let's say the GDP is $1,000,000. Well, then the per capita GDP would be really high, $1 million, the highest in the world. So it's a general measure as how wealthy a nation is and the quality of life that's going on. So how do we calculate GDP? We have three main ways: the expenditures approach, the income approach, and the value-added approach. First, let's start with the expenditures approach. It's this simple equation. It might look complicated at first, but it's simple to understand. C plus I plus G plus X minus M. What does this mean? C stands for consumer spending. It's how much the consumers are spending in the economy generally for services. So let's say it's $10 trillion in the US, where we're spending on whatever we want, McDonald's, Wendy's, whatever. Then that goes towards the GDP. I is investment spending from businesses, loans, everything investment-wise. G is government spending. So basically the government spending on military or social security, that goes towards GDP. And an X minus M confuses a lot of people. That stands for net imports or exports. Generally, net exports increases GDP, net imports decrease GDP. Because if we're taking products out of the country, that shows that our economy is doing pretty good, that our GDP is doing pretty good. So, net exports increase GDP, net imports decrease GDP. Then we have the income approach. The income approach tries to add up all the income earned from producing goods and services. So here, it's basically just the goods and services, how much we're spending. Here, it's the income from those goods and services. So we add up labor income, which is basically your wage, rental income, which is your income you earn by owning a property and getting some money from the tenant, interest income, which is just the interest earned on loaning money, and then the profit, how much businesses are profiting. Then finally, we have the value-added approach. The value-added approach is the most rare approach, but you add up the dollar value added at each stage of the production process. So here we have oranges. If we're growing oranges, that costs $1. If we're making them into orange juice, that costs another 50 cents. If we're distributing it to stores, that's $1, that's 75 cents. And then you're selling it juice to consumers, $3.50. So in total, if we're adding up all the dollar value of each stage, it's equal to $8.25. That's the total. That's how we do the value added approach. And you do that for all the products in a country, and then boom, you get the GDP. Now, there's three main limitations to GDP. First is its intermediate goods don't really count. What that means is goods included inside another good. Remember, the definition of GDP is all final goods and services. So let's say we're producing a car. Well, inside the car there might be a radio or stereo. That stereo or radio wouldn't be counted into the GDP, just the entire car as a whole. Now, the radio could make the car more valuable because you'd rather have a radio, but it's still not a part of, it's not a separate entity, if that makes sense. Then non-production transactions don't count. So financial transactions like stocks, bonds, T-bills, whatever, financially does not count because you're not producing anything. And used goods don't count. So buying a used car, that doesn't benefit the economy because it's already counted towards the GDP maybe in a previous year. And then finally, the black market or illegal transactions don't count because the government can't really see it. They can't actually determine how much is going on there, so we don't count any of that. So here's two different questions. Pause the video and try to answer them. Okay, let's go through them. Which of the following best illustrates an improvement in a country's standard of living? Well, you should have gotten A, an increase in real per capita GDP. Now, there's a very little difference between A and B. Remember, per capita GDP is basically a general way to measure quality of life in economics. So we already know it's A or B. So what's the difference between real and nominal per capita GDP? It's something we didn't really cover, so don't feel bad if you got this wrong. Nominal means it's not taking into account inflation. Real means it is taking account into inflation. So you should have gotten an A here. Because if we always want to measure an improvement in standard of living, we want to take into account inflation. Then which of the following would be included in the calculation of a country's GDP? Wages earned by citizens working domestically? Well, according to the income approach, we would take that into account, so that definitely could be it. Social security payments made to retirees, that could make sense, government spending, but we'll see. Used car sales between individuals no. Used cars, that's not production. Stocks and bonds, again, that's not production. And unpaid work by stay-at-home parents, again, that's not anything production-wise, and it's unpaid. So what's the difference between A and B? Well, B, social security payments made to retirees, that's actually incorrect. Not all government spending does count into expenditures approach. Social security payments to retirees wouldn't go towards GDP because it's not going directly towards production or their future wages, while A does. So A would be correct. So we already went over real versus nominal, but nominal does not take into account inflation. Real GDP does. Now you need to understand the basic idea of the business cycle. GDP is a general indicator of how our economy is doing, especially GDP growth. If GDP growth is increasing, that means we're improving. We're going through this expansion. If GDP is at 0% or it's not really growing, we've reached peak. A recession is when we've had a negative GDP growth for a certain amount of time. Depression is when we've had really bad economic growth for a long time. Trough is basically the bottom, and then recovery, and then expansion, we start growing again. So the GDP is a general indicator of how our economy is doing. So now you understand the basic idea of GDP, why we use GDP, how we measure GDP, and much more.